Let me just add my welcome to the one that Judy gave earlier. My name is, as she said, Jackie. I'm one of the pastors here. So it's great that we can gather, and I welcome you folks watching online, that wherever you are in the world, you will get a sense that God is with you, and that this time would be a time where you meet with God personally too. Now, we are going to be continuing in our study of the book of Mark. So if you have a Bible or you want to switch one on, if you've got it on a phone or iPad, I'll just give a brief recap of where we are up to. 2 weeks ago, we were listening to Malcolm speaking in chapter 11. Now, just to give a bit of history there, it's Jesus' final week before he goes to be crucified. He's entered into Jerusalem on the donkey. He's been to the temple, and it was there that he saw in one of the courtyards, the courtyard of the Gentiles, that people were buying and selling. And that's not what that courtyard was for. Jesus is furious. And so many of us would know the story, that he comes in and he overturns the tables. This place, this courtyard, was meant to be a place where the Gentiles could go, where there was prayer and people were preparing themselves for moving into the courts to praise and worship. So Jesus was furious because they had turned it into a human place of making money. We read that the leaders hated this man. He obviously had got their notice by now. If he hadn't before, if you can imagine going into a place where tables are overturned, well, you're going to get noticed. But he was also noticed by the ordinary people, because it says in verse 11 of verse 18 in chapter 11, that they were spellbound by him. That sense of completely captivated by what Jesus had to say. But the important people, the rabbis, the chief priests, all of the elders, they didn't like what he was doing. So today we're picking up the story. It's one day later. So Jesus has left Jerusalem and now he's come back into the temple. Interesting that he would come back to the very place where just the day before he had been attacked in certain verbal ways by the leaders. But he is a man that although they are aggressive towards him, he is not intimidated. He has a focus of purpose. That means that he keeps doing what he knows his Father is asking him to do. This week and in the next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at how those leaders try to trap him with their questions and how he manages to answer them. So that's what we're going to be starting today. So here he is in the temple courtyard. Now, often when we talk about the temple, we might just think of a building. But actually, if we look at the stories around, we actually know that the temple area was humongous. It was about 35 acres worth. And it was built on the top of a mount, Mount Zion. There was a wide outer space, which was the Gentile area. And then there were 3 other courtyards, one for the women, and then one for the men and the Israelite men, and then one for the priests. And it was inside that you actually get the main temple building. Now, around the edge of the Gentile courtyards, there were these huge colonnades. And the colonnades had pillars about 6 feet wide, so it makes ours look a bit puny, really. But they were huge, and they were about 162 of them in the royal colonnade. So we're imagining this. Jesus is walking in this arena. It's enormous. But it would have been a place that typically rabbis would have walked, and their disciples would have walked alongside them. And they walked and talked, and they maybe sat and listened to their rabbis. So that is the size of where this place was, where Jesus is now talking. So let's pick up in chapter 11, starting at verse 27. Now, I'm just going to read now until the end of that chapter. So again, they came to Jerusalem. As he was walking in the temple, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them?" Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me." They argued with one another. If we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But shall we say of human origin? They were afraid of the crowd, for all regarded John as truly a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we do not know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. So they're asking Jesus, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority? And their questions kind of indicate the structure that they expected of their system. One that if you had an authority, it was given from somebody above you. And you knew what your boundary of your power and authority was to be. Probably not so different to many societies across the world. But when they're saying doing these things, who gave you the authority to do these things? What are they actually referring to? Was it just the events of the day before, where he went in and turned over the temples? Obviously, that would be fresh in their minds. In the other Gospels of the same situation in Matthew and Luke, it talks about the fact that he cured people, lame people, deaf people. So potentially they're asking those questions. How did you do that? Who gave you this authority to do these things? But even before all these, for about 3 years, as Jesus has gone around the area, they would have either heard or heard themselves that Jesus did lots of things. He forgave sinners. He redefined the Sabbath. He accepted tax collectors. He welcomed prostitutes. And within their understanding, quite rightly, it was only God that could actually forgive sins or define the Sabbath. These were things that God had ordained. So how could Jesus do that? Now, the Gospel of Mark is one in which it's kind of silent in terms of what Jesus says about who he is. He doesn't say he is the Messiah. And that's what they're trying to find out. Are you thinking you are the Messiah? In the other Gospels, it writes of it somewhat differently. But in Mark's Gospel, that is what we're told through this author. So they're saying to him, well, how did you do these things? And in relation to the people, Jesus welcomed people that they definitely wouldn't. They hated the tax collectors. They were part of the Roman institution. They were people who took more money than they should have taken, and so the Jewish people didn't like them. And here's Jesus relating to them. Jesus relates to the prostitutes. No good Jewish rabbi would ever be seen with somebody like that. Well, certainly not in public. So Jesus is offending their code of conduct constantly, because they had a perception of what was right and wrong, and they would have backed up their behaviors by going to their scriptures, what we have as the Old Testament. And in fairness to them, God had given them rules, ways to do things. But for what purpose? It certainly wasn't just to do all the rules in exactly the right way. It was because God said, I want you to be a holy nation. I want you to be different to all the other nations that surround you. And so the ways that he gave them to do that was to make them different, to make them pure and holy people like he was pure and holy. But the problem had become that they'd lost the reason, and they had just gone to fulfilling the rules. And they thought if people abided by the rules, they were good. And if they broke the rules, then they weren't. How about us? Are you a person who likes to have clear boundaries of right and wrong? Or maybe you're a rule breaker and think the only good reason to have a rule is to break it. Typical Baptist nonconformist. There was a time when my children were younger, we went to visit the house at West Wickham. And our daughter, bless her, I won't name her, we came to the part where there was this lovely green, and there was a notice that said, do not walk in front of this notice. So what did she do? She picked up the notice and walked with it. I'm not going to say is always a rule breaker, she is not. But it's a case of what's the letter of the law? What's the reason for why the rules are there? Of course, they wanted to keep their grass nice. And of course, we, as good parents, made her put it back. But I think it kind of draws to our attention that we as people have all sorts of reasons that go within us as to why we do what we do. I wonder if any of you have ever read this book. It's called Watching the English by Kate Fox. Has anybody read this book? There was only one person in the first service also. But it's a fascinating read. And as an English person, I feel like I can talk about it because this is poking fun at people like me. And in parts, I literally I had tears pouring down my face, laughing about the way she could see what English people do. And if you're from another culture here, I'm sure you would resonate with some of her understanding. So there are things that she says all cultures have. We all have rules about how we live life. We have rules about food, what times meals, what we dress like, how we should dress when we come to church, the way you greet people, how much hospitality, what does hospitality look like, even how you joke. All those things are things, and there are many more that we in any culture have as the way that we do things. You only have to cross the channel to France to see they don't do it like we do it, do they? Now, she's particularly studied the English, and one of her comments about us, if you are English, is that we can seem hypocritical. And that doesn't sound too good. The reason is that the English have a way of not saying what they really mean. Are you aware of that? She says, we are prone to polite pretense rather than honest assertiveness. But the reason we do this, she says, is because we have some very strong underlying values about modesty and courtesy and fair play. Are you aware that's why you do what you do? So we don't like saying things bluntly because it might be offensive to somebody else or sound proud or arrogant. So actually, whilst our motivations may be good, to other people who hear us or around us, we can seem not to be speaking honestly. After the first service, I was talking to a couple. They've lived in Colombia. He is Colombian, she has learned Spanish. And he was saying, as they're a married couple, how often in their conversations with each other, he will say things or she will say things, and they just kind of miss each other a bit. And of course, British people, English people, will always say please and thank you. You don't just say pass the salt. You say please pass the salt. Because that's polite, isn't it? And so often to our ears, if we hear it from another culture, it sounds different. When we lived overseas in Africa, I can remember hearing the way people spoke to each other, and it felt abrupt and harsh. They had no intention for that to be the way of it. But for we as English, we are bounded with our politeness. But going back to the religious leaders, the difference in this story is that their questioning of Jesus may have looked nice on the surface because they're just asking him a question, but underneath is a nasty motivation. They're trying to trick him. They're jealous people. They're fearful people. Potentially, they want God's name to be honored, and they thought this was the way to do it. But they probably underlyingly just wanted him gone. So how does Jesus answer their question? Well, what he does, is it just a clever deflection? Is it just a question that seems to be completely random? Or is it him almost trying to dodge the issue, a bit like somebody being hunted, that they'd run into a river because it takes the scent off? Now, actually, it was quite common for a rabbi to answer a question by giving a question. It was a part of the way they did their dialogue. And so to us, they can seem unrelated, but actually, they're quite intertwined. Because when Jesus asked them, did the baptism of John come from heaven or was it of human origin, in verse 30, what he's asking them to consider is whose authority did John have? Because John had come, as he had said, to be a forerunner to another. And then when he'd seen Jesus, he said, that's the one I'm a forerunner to. So if they agreed that John's baptism was from heaven, as in from God, then ultimately, if you join the dots, it meant that Jesus' authority had also come from heaven. But they wouldn't admit that because they had their rules, and they certainly didn't want to admit that Jesus had come from heaven because they were the important people. And then they weren't going to be able to say it was of human origin because there in that colonnade, they were surrounded with lots of other people who very much believed that John's baptism came from God. So they were stuck. They were stuck in this kind of way of they can't answer one way, so they used the let out of, we don't know. Stuck by rules and traditions is something that perhaps we all need to be aware of, that we ourselves can be stuck in doing things one way and one way only, because that's what we feel comfortable with. For each of us, whether we're English or from other cultures, and in this room actually we have quite an array of people from other cultures. I am a woman of my culture. I like queues, because queues are fair. Because if you get there first, you should be served first. Isn't that right? You know, that's fair. Whereas when we lived in India and we went to get a bus, a case was a bus came along. It didn't matter how long you'd been there for. What ruled was your elbows. It was all like this, getting. And people would get to the bus, throw their luggage in the window, and try to climb in the window. There's no sense of what we think of as fairness. Now, I was thinking about asking you to get into pairs at this point and ask you to think now, which are the things in your life that push your buttons? That if people do things differently, you feel jolly uncomfortable and you're more likely to get quite angry about it. Because quite often we can see what matters to us by how emotionally attached we become to certain things. But then I thought we might end up with a few arguments amongst us as we are such a mixed group. But maybe I'm being a bit too soft with you, because what Jesus does next is to tell one of his stories. And in the telling of his story, he puts his finger right on the button of what was important to these religious leaders. So let's pick up the story, beginning of chapter 12. Now imagine yourself in that colonnade. It's vast. There's the religious leaders, there's Jesus, and there's a growing number of people. And of course, people love stories, so they're listening in. What's this story going to be telling us? And imagine, what would your reaction be? Perhaps if you were a religious leader, or maybe you're one of the crowd. Would you be pro or anti what you hear? Now, he's going to tell a story about an absentee vineyard owner. Now, to us, that's something we don't have in our culture, but it was very familiar to them. So this wasn't a story beyond their understanding. So let's pick it up in verse 1 of chapter 12. Then he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. And then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat and others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyards to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. When they realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd. So they left him and went away. Now, usually when interpreting parables, we wouldn't expect that every detail will have a specific meaning, as happens with an allegory. But actually, this parable is a bit of an exception because although not all the details have an inner meaning, there are more than usual. So Jesus is talking in his pictures, but they would have actually understood what he was alluding to. So the owner of the vineyard would have been God. The vineyard itself was the people of Israel. And that would have been familiar to them because they would have known the narrative of Isaiah. In Isaiah 5, it talks about how God is the vineyard owner and the people of Israel are the people there in that way. And so they knew that from the old stories that they were the people in this picture. The vineyard was given all the equipment it needed to read. There was the wall to mark out the boundary, to keep out the robbers, probably to defend against wild animal attacks. There was the wine press, where the grapes were trodden down with the feet, and then the vat underneath, where the juice of the wine was stored. And the tower would have been the place where they'd have had lodgings for the workers, also doubled up as the place they would watch for the attack. The tenants are the rulers of Israel throughout the history of the nation, and the slaves whom the owner sends stand for the many prophets that God had sent. People like Moses or David, they were all called servants of the Lord. Many others, Amos, Jeremiah, Zechariah, these were all the prophets that God had sent to the people of Israel. And then, of course, the Son is Jesus. So even on the first telling, most of this story would have been plain. They would have made the connections. And we even hear that in Leviticus, if the owner had followed the rules, the laws, the first time of collecting their rental from such a vineyard would have been 5 years later. So they had ways of knowing how all of this worked out in their culture. So they would have pieced it together. They would have understood Jesus is nailing them. He's saying the religious leaders have always misunderstood. They have turned away from the people who God had sent to them. Now, unlike leaders of today who might pick up a mobile phone and do a few tweets, they did not have that means to ridicule or justify themselves, but they were waiting. They were waiting for their opportunity to get him back. Jesus had only told a story, so they couldn't actually nail him for blasphemy, but they knew that he was actually saying things about them and about who he was. He outsmarted them. Now, people all over the world, whichever culture you're from, if you feel attacked, it's typical that you want to fight back, isn't it? We will all do that. It's something about self-justification, and it's a big man or woman who actually can hear criticism and stop enough to say, is this true of me? Is this true? Have I done these things wrong? If somebody comes to you and says, what you've just done, what you've just said is not correct, would you feel comfortable or would you justify yourself? So what about the crowd gathered there in that colonnade? What did they hear? Are they kind of going, yeah, he's got them. He's managed to nail these nasty religious leaders who tell us what to do and always make us feel small. We don't know, apart from the fact we know that they were listening intently to what Jesus said. For me, as I read this story, and I have to say as I prepare, I read it over and over, what really struck me, which was brought out in Lydia's excellent demonstration of the cream on the pancake, is the generosity of God. Time and again, he sent his prophets to these people, even though they kept rejecting, even though they beat them up, insulted, killed. The story through the Old Testament of the way the prophets were treated. For a time, the people may come back, but not always, but then they wanted their own way. Why did the owner in the story keep giving and giving and giving? We would say it's because he loved the people of Israel. He had a plan, a purpose for them. He wanted them to do what he'd asked them to do, which was to be a holy people. And then to send his son. Would I send my son? I have one son and 2 daughters. Well, we have, Andy and I. Would I ask my son to go to a place where I knew many other people had been sent before to be hurt and killed? I'd probably say to my son, no, don't do that, don't do that. But God sent Jesus. Jesus went because there was a purpose so much bigger going on. Perhaps the people, the tenants of this vineyard, as it would seem, did not think that there was any problem. They could do what they wanted to do. Nobody would find out. We'll keep the vineyard. It will be ours. We'll take what belonged to the heir. But actually, God has not finished. In verse 9, it shows the owner is not powerless. If you look at that verse, it says, what then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and he will destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. This was a warning to them, but they probably didn't want to hear it. I reckon today people are really not so different. We still think, individually perhaps, certainly as society, that we can do what we like and God doesn't really notice. We don't like talking about God as a judge because her judgment sounds harsh, and how dare somebody else tell me what is right or wrong. But just like the tenants, people in our culture, we live with this expectation that we can just get away with things. We don't deserve to be punished, do we? Even people who lie or kill, they have a system that they think, oh, well, if nobody finds out, it's okay for me. So the general attitude is, if I can get away with it, I will. That happens on the small detail of life as well as the larger in our society, in our political systems. What's the truth anymore? What does the media tell us is true? Do we believe it? Or is it just because some political or newspaper person wants to paint a picture of a certain way? The only thing that seems to be accepted is tolerance. But we can't always be tolerant because we live in a world that is not living right. And we have a purpose. Like the people of Israel were meant to be a light to their world, we are meant to be a light in our world. And it can be difficult to say to somebody else, there is another way. You need to understand that God is watching. He does want things to be done in a different way. Powerful people will always try to keep their power. But we as Christians need to be people who are unafraid, like Jesus, to go back, to be able to speak plainly into situations that we might be involved in, whether or not it's at the school, on a PTA, whether it's in a business, where it's in the home. We have a responsibility to speak for truth. Recently, I was at a talk not far away from here, and it was a woman who was speaking about the work she does working with prostitutes, because these women have been trafficked into our country to be sex slaves. And God had put on her heart that this was not okay. And so what she did, first of all, she felt that she should go and pray around the areas where she knew some of these things were happening. She had no previous knowledge of this sort of thing, but God had put in her the sense of injustice this was for these women. So she started to pray. And then she met other people and was encouraged because she found other people God had put these same women on their hearts, and they started to pray around these areas together. And then she met some of the women themselves and heard some of their stories. And then she even met some of the traffickers, and her anger burned against them. And she had conversations with some of these traffickers. But then she found out that there was a cost involved in being involved in this work. And twice she's had to be put under police protection because the traffickers wanted to hurt her. She, as a Christian, however, refused to be put off. But she said it's hard, it's costly to walk that journey for her. And I believe for all of us, whether or not we're ever involved in something like that, we need to be prepared to face the cost. In our culture, it's often been the Christians who have stood up to stop slavery, to stop children going up chimneys. It's the Christian people who saw the injustice. So in our culture today, the challenge is to say, what are the areas of injustice that we need to stand up for? If we expect, as followers of Jesus, not to be rejected, then in one way we're not really following in the footsteps of the one who we follow. Jesus did make it plain, as hard as it is to say, that to walk in his steps would be hard. If he was despised and rejected, misunderstood, mocked, beaten, eventually killed, all because the leaders refused to see and respond to all the good he did, then we too need to accept that as we walk our walk with God, it's not going to be easy. We do live in increasingly challenging times as people of faith. We might have started out on our walk with quite strong passion, as often young believers do. They're out there to face the world and they're going to make a difference, and it's wonderful. I love talking to young Christians because they have that vibrancy of, no, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to do it. And then sometimes things squash in and it gets tougher and people lose that vitality. So perhaps this morning we need a new injection of courage to face the costs, but actually see it's worth it, that we can do it with God's help. That you want again to be a person of passion, wherever you are, Monday to Saturday, amongst your family, amongst your friends. Perhaps we need God to help us to be able to speak to people that we love dearly. And I know this isn't easy. I have my own parents, my brother, they're not believers. And it's very difficult sometimes to know how to speak to people with any sense of challenge. Jesus used a story. I don't know how I could use a story with my family, but I need wisdom. And we often need wisdom to know, how do we take this message about the love of God, but actually about the fact that he has a boundary for the way he wants us to live. And he knows that's for our good. Of course, we need the Holy Spirit in us to do that. We cannot do that. We're not strong enough. We're not wise enough. And so maybe today you need wisdom, as I do. In Isaiah chapter 55, these are words that probably are very familiar to you. It says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." We need to be people who listen to God's thoughts and do them. We need to be people who encourage each other as a family of Christians to stand firm for good, to do the things that we know are right. When we see injustices, we can all do things. We can all pray. Maybe we can write to our MPs. I have to say this last 2 years, twice in the last year I wrote to our MP here. And actually it ended up with a dialogue. And you kind of might think, oh, if you just sign a petition, you make no difference. But I have to say, if you write letters, you definitely seem to get positive responses. That was about the refugees that I saw that we seem to be excluding from this country. And it ended up being this dialogue amongst the MPs and myself. And I just thought, well, I don't know what difference that makes, but it was the right thing to do for me. So I think we need, as people, to be encouraged that with the Holy Spirit's enabling, we can do what is right. And if you come today and you're weary because you're tired or you feel you've lost your passion, maybe this is a time to actually ask God, please give me back my passion.